This project is the hyper book of a hyper reading of Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man. The hyper book aspect is the fact that it's both a video book, an audio book, and a text book as transcribed on my blog and maybe in other places, and that it also includes other aspects such as interviews and recordings of articles that I've made in the past on subjects that are relevant to the reading of Laruelle's book. The hyper reading aspect is the fact that I am trying to read a biography of ordinary man with contemporary eyes, and in particular eyes informed by thinkers who have come to launch forth research programs using similar concepts, in particular those of radical multiplicity, renewed idea of the subject, and of the absolute. So in this chapter, I want to give a reading of an English translation of a paper I gave 3 years ago when Badiou's Immanence of Truths came out in French. I was invited to a conference where Badiou was present. You can see the video recording of me giving my paper next to Badiou on my YouTube channel, and Badiou quite liked it, so I will read it, but whenever it seems relevant, I'll intersperse the reading with any new reflections, especially on the relation to Laruelle's book. The title is My Path Through Badiou's The Immanence of Truths. I say my path, but in fact it's 5 paths at least, and we'll see that as the reading goes on. Philosophical intensities and the language of the infinite. The first part is not numbered, part 0 if you want. It's supposedly the abstract, but it's more than that. The aim of Badiou's book is to convince us that we live in L, the constructible universe. This is just standard mathematical terminology in set theory. So L is a constructible universe where the sets are describable in terms of known or constructible predicates. So the book is Badiou's book aims to convince us that we live in L, the constructible universe, without being aware that this is the case, and to guide us progressively from L to V, which is defined as the class of all sets. It's a class, it's not a set, so that allows us to avoid various paradoxes, and that allows Badiou to call this V, which is a mathematical concept, the class of all sets, to call it the absolute. This is the universe containing the large non-constructible infinities, and so the aim of the book is to convince us that we live in L, the constructible universe, to guide us progressively from L to V, the class of all sets, to elevate us to the absolute, and to take us down again into the finitude of L, equipped with perceptions drawn from V, thus permitting us to re-index the world according to absoluteness and no longer in terms of relativity. And I think there's a lot in this idea of to re-index the world. It means to re-perceive the world and perceive within the finite world of L the traces of contact with the absolute, to perceive these traces and perhaps even to create traces of contact with the absolute. So to reindex the world according to absoluteness and no longer in terms of relativity, thus getting out of the problem that with all the deconstructions, as we said with Laruelle, Laruelle takes us directly to the absolute in this book, A Biography of Ordinary Man, to get away from all the problems around relativism, that multiplicities seems to open up a whole realm of relativity, and that's why Laruelle distinguishes between relative multiplicities and absolute multiplicities. We could summarize the global movement with the slogan, L is hell, but V is free. My path through the book, The Immanence of Truths, is multiple and comprises the following aspects. 1. A conceptual path centered on philosophical pluralism and on the book's concepts concerning the multiple types of infinities. So that's what I still consider to be Badiou's way of situating himself within this vast meta-research program in contemporary French philosophy of the relations between the one and the many, and of ways of privileging the many multiplicities, pluralism, without falling into the relativist trap. And the idea of the multiple types of infinities is Badiou's solution to this problematic of the one and the multiplicities. He finds within the language of mathematics a potential for creating concepts even richer than those that have been provided from his point of view intuitively within philosophy, and that provide a solution to this idea of a pluralism that would not be relativism, of an absolute multiplicity that would not be bound by, enclosed by the relative multiplicities of standard philosophy. 2. A poetic path centered on the movements of descent into the hell of the finitude of the waste product, cut off from infinity, of purgation. So we're sort of in hell, but we're not really in hell enough. So we have to descend into hell, which is the realm of everything is detritus, everything is waste, everything is just sort of merchandise, interchangeable, that circulates in capitalism. And the opposite of the waste product is the creation of a work. So the poetic path takes us on the movement of descent into hell, into the hell of finitude and of the capitalist products of consumption, the waste products, and that cut us off from infinity, and then to take us up by means of purgation. In Badiou's case, it's a purgation by way of mathematics, of ascension to paradise, the paradise of the absolute, or the term was used from near the beginning of set theory, Cantor's paradise, and finally the redescent into the finitude of the work, touched by the infinite. So the work is still in the world of what Badiou calls finitude, but it carries the touch of the absolute. There's a first difference. I think this model is Laruelle's model, except in A Biography of Ordinary Man, instead of the progressive ascension, Laruelle in the forward describes a leap into the absolute, but this leap can't be done without some sort of preparation. His preparation was his work of the 70s and his transitional book of 1981, The Minority Principle. But once you go through it, this transition, this purgation and radicalization and transvaluation, you can, from a didactic point of view, begin with the absolute. A second difference is that the vocabulary of infinities has been, you could say reversed, but Badiou has enriched the vocabulary, the philosophical vocabulary of infinities by describing different sizes of infinities, and also by including the Cohen concept that there exist constructible infinities, that is definable by known or constructible predicates, and unconstructible infinities. So where Laruelle talks about this world of finitude, of hell, as a world of infinity, and the absolute as a world of the finite individual, one could easily see that Laruelle does not make, as yet, this distinction between the constructible infinite, which corresponds to his world of the infinities of the sciences, the human sciences, and the philosophy, and the non-constructible infinite, which might be a better description of the absolute than Laruelle's affirmation of finitude in this particular book, A Biography of Ordinary Man. Third, or three, a linguistic path centered on the question of the type of language that is the most appropriate for speaking of our world and our life. Alain Badiou demonstrates the depth and fecundity of a philosophical language drawn from the mathematics of the higher infinite. So the question of what sort of language do we need to get away from the continent of relativism that we've been confined to. Laruelle's bid in A Biography of Ordinary Man is that we need a language of the absolute, the one, the individual, and as other synonyms of multiplicities and minorities, but also of finitude. Badiou's idea of the necessary language to get away from the continent of relativism is a language of the absolute, as for Laruelle, of multiplicities, dispersions, minorities, why not? But it's also a language of infinities. This is the solution that Deleuze and Guattari adopt as well in What is Philosophy. So we have Laruelle's solution of the absolute and multiplicities tied to finitude as the language that is necessary to escape the continent of relativism, or the domain of the cosmos where hell is, and Badiou's and Deleuze and Guattari's idea that we need a language of the absolute, of multiplicities, and of infinities. So it's interesting to see what are the arguments for either choice? For a contextual path, centered on a comparison of Badiou's rigorous mathematically based analysis and division of the concept of the infinite, with Deleuze's more intuitive and poetic conceptions of the infinite and of the absolute in what is philosophy. So this contextual path is the one I'm sort of continuing today by examining not just Badiou's Immanence of Truths and Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy, but also Laruelle's biography of Ordinary Man. 5. A subjective path centered on what the book can change, both in our relation to the infinite and in the reader's philosophical unconscious. This is crucial in that Laruelle, in a biography of Ordinary Man, begins with the absolute and with the requirement, the double requirement, that we need a language and a way of thinking that is more rigorous than standard philosophy and more human. So the absolute is identified with the individual and vice versa. So the subject is a crucial element of the new language, the noetic language that we need to get away from the region of relativism. This is the case in Badiou as well, who has totally renewed the concept of the subject, and it's also the case in What is Philosophy, building on Deleuze's examination of the processes of subjectivation that he found at work in Foucault's later phases. Okay, that's the end of the abstract. Now, first path, the conceptual path, pluralism versus relativism. In this first section, I will talk about the search for a pluralism that does not fall into the trap of relativism, or the search for absolute multiplicities that don't fall into the trap of relative multiplicities. Badiou has pursued his ontological research program for over 50 years. During this period, he has published hundreds of texts. Okay, over 50 years, that's probably a good description of Laruelle's philosophical duration. Laruelle and Badiou were born in the same year, so they're both 84 this year. During this period, Badiou has published hundreds of texts. One of the guiding threads of this abundant production is pluralism, a thought of the pure multiple, of pure multiplicities, and also of the plurality of truth procedures, and of the plurality of infinites. I'd just like to note that this idea of the plurality of truth procedures is very important. It's a point where Laruelle will evolve. For Badiou, there are 4 truth procedures: science, including mathematics, art, including poetry, politics, and love, including psychoanalysis, and I would argue including religion. That religion needs a place, and unless Badiou wants to create a 5th condition, sometimes he envisaged that maybe religion was a truth procedure in other epochs, and other times he just rules that out. But one way of including religion as a truth procedure is to include it in the truth procedure of love. Laruelle, on the other hand, in a biography of Ordinary Man, places the truth procedure that he's following as science, science, science. It's only later when he coins the word non-philosophy and makes it evolve further that he'll come to the idea of plurality of conditions of non-standard philosophy, including religion and art, maybe love, I don't know. Badiou is a pluralist, and it is as such that he has attracted and held my attention, because that was my problem from the beginning of the 70s, the problem of multiplicities and pluralism. I have been following Badiou's work for 40 years. So I came to France in 1980, 81. I was vaguely aware, I'd read some stuff by Badiou, and from that time I followed as much as possible, at least his books as they came out, and I followed Laruelle over that same time period of 40 years. On my blog, Agent Swarm, I discuss the ideas of a number of contemporary thinkers who work in the domain of epistemological and ontological pluralism. So basically, I discuss Laruelle, Badiou, Deleuze, Feyerabend, Zizek, Stigler, Bruno Latour, from this point of view of epistemological and ontological pluralism, and beyond, if there is a way of radicalizing that even further. This analysis is based on the idea that one can better understand a philosophy by considering it not in isolation as a static system, but as a research program evolving in the context of other programs of the same type. So the founding idea of my blog is a hyper reading of the pluralist thinkers of today. I cannot classify myself as a Deleuzian, as a Feyerabendian, as a Zizekian, as a Laruellian. I want to get all those research programs into explicit dialogue, because I think they are already indirectly, implicitly, perhaps even explicitly, but silently, but to get them all publicly into dialogue with each other, because that can only enrich each and help them progress even further. I employ this expression of research program in the wide sense that Karl Popper gives it. A metaphysical research program is a general conceptual framework comprising both non-testable speculative elements and testable empirical elements. So I'm using metaphysics, or in fact the adjective metaphysical, in a sense different from Laruelle and probably from Badiou, and that's tough if you don't like that. That's me. I'm not a Laruellian, so I'm not going to use metaphysics as Laruelle defines it, because then it becomes sort of a tautology, a truth by definition, that Laruelle is not doing metaphysics. And then you get Laruellians who say Laruelle is not doing metaphysics, and they don't even bother to note that that's a true by definition, and it's one very limited definition at that of metaphysics. So just to get a flexibility in the discussion, a flexibility and a fluidity that will make possible the encounters between the different research programs in this domain, I'm taking Popper's very wide idea of metaphysical research program, which has non-testable speculative elements and testable empirical elements. So it's not an idea of integral testability. You don't need integral testability. You need only what you could call testability enough testability. So a metaphysical research program can and must be taken seriously in terms of it having a speculative, conceptually creative aspect, and at the same time an empirical aspect. If it has no empirical aspect in the sense of testability at all, it's a purely formal game, and probably, I think probably, but there may be exceptions, probably not worth taking too seriously. On the other hand, complete testability doesn't exist even in the hard sciences, the traditionally called hard sciences. So what we need is enough testability and not total testability. The theoretical projects which interest me are all pluralist in the sense that they escape the hegemony of the one, in this sense of the one as totality, and give speculative priority to the multiple and to multiplicities outside the speculative totality. I seek to analyze these projects, to compare them, and to put them in dialogue in terms of a set of shared criteria. In particular, one can examine a pluralist research program in terms of its type and degree of immanence and of its testability. Okay, there are other criteria. These are two other criteria that I've developed in their application on my blog. So these criteria are not absolute. They're types and degrees, and they're not all necessary. They're sort of a pragmatic, heuristic set of criteria that you can use to compare and evaluate different research programs. So there's type and degree of immanence, of testability, of realism, of historicity, of thanks to Laruelle and Badiou, of type and degree of infinity and of absolutity or absoluteness. From this point of view, Badiou's Being and Event trilogy is exemplary. It constitutes a summa ontologica in 3 volumes. One, I'm giving a page count here just to show the evolution, so I'm using the French titles, so I think that's a reflection of the French books, but it must be the same in English. Being an Event, 570 pages. Logics of Worlds, 630 pages. The Immanence of Truths, 710 pages. So over almost 2,000 pages, Badiou leads us on the path of an extended meditation on the dialectic of the finite and the infinite, guiding us towards an immanent understanding of being, truths, worlds, the subject, and the absolute. This project is highly speculative, but it is elaborated under the conditions of the 4 truth procedures, which assure a degree of indirect testability for his thought, just as Laruelle, in A Biography of Ordinary Man, situates thought outside the hegemony of the question and under the condition of science. The Immanence of Truths is an invitation to embark on a passionately inspiring adventure, combining movements of vertiginous ascension, thanks to the abstraction of mathematical language, and of precipitous descent towards concrete life, empowered by poetic language. One could also say empowered by artistic forms, whether you want to call them languages exclusively or not is another question. Empowered also by love and politics. These movements are not unique to the mathematical procedure. According to Badiou's system, we can find these movements also in the other truth procedures, the poem, love, and politics. So I just said that the downward movement is empowered by mathematics, the poem, love, and politics, but in fact, another argument would be that the ascent too is empowered, or can be empowered, by the poem, love, and politics. Badiou, to make the conceptual breakthrough that we need in distinguishing the different types of infinities and in discerning the absolute, draws heavily on mathematical language. And I think he's right. I think he manages to get to a conceptual creation that nobody else in that domain has been able to attain, even if they've attained other types of conceptual creation that maybe Badiou hasn't. At least there, to get a real breakthrough, the method, the heuristic technique of relying on mathematics and working through some very abstract mathematics has been quite fruitful in terms of conceptual creation. 2. So we just did one was the conceptual path, pluralism versus relativism. 2. The poetic path, the divine comedy and the Retorno. In this section, I will compare the immanence of truths with a poem, Dante's Divine Comedy, to help us see the global and specific movements of Badiou's project. When mathematicians and philosophers talk about the beauty of Cantor's paradise, of higher and higher infinities or transfinite numbers, we should understand this in terms of Dante's Paradiso as abstract poem. Dante's ascent finishes on the poet's vision of the love that moves the sun and the other stars, so of the absolute. This allows us to establish the link between Dante's ascent to paradise and Plato's ascension to the ideas, and it also highlights that Dante's poem is incomplete because after this ascent to infinite abstraction, we need to descend to finite life again. Otherwise, we do not include the finite incarnated Dante, the poet who has visited these three realms and who has returned to tell us of them. The poem needs to be completed by a fourth part, the Retorno. So we've got the Inferno, where we are, if we dig down a bit, we find we're in hell. We've got the Purgatorio, which the purgation, which the peeling away of what Laruelle calls the anthropological predicates. That's the purgation, till we get to the absolute, the paradiso, and then we need to come back to what Laruelle calls ordinary life, but finding the points, the touches, the traces of the absolute within that ordinary life. This process of the Retorno is absent from Dante's Divine Comedy. It stops with the vision of the absolute, and then we're left to sort of make our way without any poetic experience or guidebook to get us back to the ordinary level without forgetting what we saw in the absolute vision. Badiou starts his book with the analysis of the operators of finitude as the basis of the system of oppression. This is his Inferno, the hell of living under the forced regime of finitude. The modern form of finitude is what he calls covering. It is based on the idea that the universe of sets is L, the constructible universe. So that's the formula for ideology. Living in the world of ideology is living in hell, and in Badiou's vocabulary, it's the world of finitude. Anything that happens that could, well, first we have just everything that happens is controlled and conceived in terms of constructible predicates, and anything that promises change, anything that is anomalous, anything that is not in its place, is either brought back to the existing constructed predicates, or the authorities construct a new predicate or a new set of predicates to contain and cover over these anomalous developments. So Badiou starts there with the operators of finitude and the covering over. So the universe of sets, which is L, the constructible universe. The book then ascends, taking us on a voyage through the different types of infinity. So Badiou, following the mathematics of large infinites, distinguishes 4 types of infinity. Inaccessible, so here we're talking about non-constructible infinities. Inaccessible, resistant to partition, complete, and approaching the absolute. So they're higher and higher infinities. In this ascent, we are in purgatory. The turning point comes when Badiou expounds a theorem allowing the defeat of covering. He then moves up the hierarchy of higher and higher infinities, mounting to the absolute, V, the class of all sets, which is not itself a set. The analogy between Badiou's book and Dante's Divine Comedy is striking, except that the immanence of truths provides the missing 4th part, as it accomplishes the redescent, the Retorno, the redescent, not only mathematically, but also philosophically into finitude, touched by the infinite. Each of the 4 truth procedures, art, science, love, and politics, but Badiou always calls politics as truth procedure, invented politics. Each of these 4 truth procedures are examined to determine their index of absoluteness. This is the point in which, while still remaining within the regime of finitude, Laruelle would say within the regime of infinitude, and Badiou would reply, yes, in the regime of constructible infinitude, so that's still finitude. Anyhow, this is the point in which, while still remaining within the regime of finitude, the work, in the sense of the work of art, the work produced by each truth procedure can be said to touch the absolute. I read the Divine Comedy as an onto-theological poem precisely because it ascends to the absolute of love by means of poetic abstraction and remains there, unable to return from transcendence to concrete human life, to ordinary man and ordinary human life. One can compare this with Deleuze's emphasis in his cinema seminars on the danger of a possible dualist dead end. So we've got the relative world or hell and then the absolute. So that's an absolute that is dualist is not absolute enough for almost any of these thinkers. So Deleuze warns us against the possible dualist dead end in the move towards complete abstraction. He explicitly favoured the works of transformative redescent that comport what he called re-injection, or the inclusion of elements of pure abstraction into reworked mundane forms. That's something that came up in Deleuze's explicitly in Deleuze's cinema seminars, but you can see the same idea work all over the place in Deleuze. 3. Linguistic Path, the language of infinities. In this third section, I will speak about the problem of the choice of an appropriate language to speak about the contemporary world and our life. I probably should have called this the language of infinities and of the absolute, because I discussed both. But I was concentrating on this mathematical purgation by way of higher and higher infinities. Badiou's starting point is the secularization of the infinite brought about by Cantor's revolutionary approach, which also brought about a pluralization of the infinite. Badiou's research program adopts the hypothesis that it is possible to speak of our world and our life in terms of a language of infinities derived from Cantor's breakthrough, derived by way of philosophical conceptual creation, but still derived from Cantor's breakthrough. The popular stereotype about Cantor is that he invented transfinite arithmetic, but that he was also mentally deranged and theologically obsessed in a naive, autodidactic sort of way. However, Cantor was in fact quite philosophically literate, and I find it interesting that he had a well worked out philosophy of the infinite, and that he read Spinoza and Leibniz very closely. His discoveries led him to distinguish different sizes of infinity, allowing him to reread the classical philosophers from a new point of view. A quote from George Cantor, his Mathematics and Philosophy of the Infinite, by Joseph Warren Dalban, page 123. Cantor's inquisitive "how infinite" was an impossible question. To minds like Spinoza and Leibniz, the infinite in this absolute sense was incomprehensible, as was God, and therefore any attempt to assign a basis for determining magnitudes other than merely potential ones was predestined to fail. So if it's infinite, it's infinite. If it's absolute, it's absolute. And the infinite is absolute, and that's all. And Cantor comes along and he creates the concept of different types and different sizes of infinity, and that changes everything. Unlike Badiou, Cantor does not identify the absolute with V, the class of all sets. On the contrary, he distinguishes them for theological reasons, and so subsumes the transfinite to the regime of the one. Once again, the one as the totality, as the identification of the absolute with the totality, which is something that both Badiou and Laruelle wish to liquidate. They want to get away from this nefarious identification, which is theological. However, I think that there is still good reason to distinguish the absolute from V, and that Badiou does so implicitly in that he carefully distinguishes philosophical concepts as metaphorizations or poetizations of mathematics from mathematics itself. So even if there's a lot, I don't know how much, a third of the book of the 730 pages of Immanence of Truth is mathematics. It's just could be separated out as a mathematical textbook if you took away some of the philosophical commentaries that are present even in the mathematical portions. But basically what Badiou is doing is not mathematics. He's making a strong and fecund use of mathematics, but he's poetizing, metaphorizing as a way of getting to conceptual creation that is not mathematical creation. So this is in reference to Badiou's thesis that philosophy is a poetization of mathematics. Well, that's nice of him to privilege mathematics like that, but I think philosophy is a poetization of love. Philosophy is a poetization of politics, And even because we can radicalize and meta-levelize, philosophy is a poetization of poetry as well. In contrast, from a Deleuzian perspective, Badiou's concepts, which are based on a mathematical hierarchy of infinite cardinals, are insufficiently philosophical. While still poetic, they are much closer to the mathematical end of the spectrum. We've got a spectrum going from poetry, from philosophy through poetry to mathematics. The poetry region is closer to the philosophical transcendental field than it is to mathematics, and also far closer to philosophy than mathematics is. Unfortunately, according to Deleuze, this poetic region is differentiated, and there's a philosophical end in this poetic segment and a more mathematical end. And according to Deleuze, Badiou is too close in his poetizing conceptual creation to the mathematical end. That's a little arbitrary. What does it mean, too close? We'll get to a specification of what that means in a second. While still poetic, they are much closer. Badiou's concepts are much closer to the mathematical end of the spectrum of the poetry segment, and so represent a slowing down of the plane of consistency. However, even this Deleuzian critical term of slowing down is itself intuitive and poetical. Well, Deleuze and Guattari are constantly talking about absolute speed, absolute horizon, absolute survey, and then this absolute speed, which belongs to the transcendental field of philosophy, is slowed down to get the plane of reference of science, for example, and maybe before it gets that slowed down, it's already slowed down to get to the plane of composition of art and poetry. And I see no reason to give that as a universally valid criterion of the difference between philosophy and mathematics, for example, and between artistic or intuitive philosophy and mathematically inspired philosophy. This idea of slowing down is, aside from how are we going to estimate, can different people have different estimations in a relativistic framework of different speeds, just that it's too much of a sort of block approach to the different procedures of thought. Philosophy, okay, it has absolute speed, but that can't be all of philosophy. Lots of philosophy is, in fact, very slowed down. The concepts are sort of congealed and rigidified and crystallized, and that's sometimes a good thing. You need some slowness, and sometimes a bad thing, and they need to be sped up, at least at certain moments. But maybe there are some concepts that they just shouldn't be crystallized out to specifically. And the same can be said for science and mathematics. There are concepts and procedures within science that are relatively slow, and then in the intense conceptual creation around infinities, around quantum theory and string theory and so on, we're getting absolute speeds that are far faster in comparison than many of the philosophical concepts that we're faced with today. So I think this absolute speed and relative speed, or slowed down versus accelerated, can't be applied in a block manner. 4. Contextual Path, Badiou, Deleuze, and Infinities. And implicitly today, I'm prolonging the contextual path with a reference to Laruelle, as much as can be done in this sort of active rethinking of my paper. In this fourth section, I will compare the different types of infinity described and analyzed by Badiou with Deleuze's treatment of this theme. The infinite plays an important role in Deleuze's thought, but it has not been the object of much discussion. Badiou's set theoretic conceptual creations can provide us with a useful point of comparison. Contrary to Badiou, Deleuze does not make use of set theory. Well, he refers to it from time to time, but that's all, but prefers an intuitive and qualitative approach to the infinite. Despite this difference, there are important points of convergence between the two theoretical projects. So, in Immanence of Truths, Badiou distinguishes, as we said, 4 types of infinites. Inaccessible infinites, infinites by resistance to division or partition, infinites by immanent power, and infinites by increasing proximity to the absolute. Once we've got these 4 different types of infinity, we can look back on Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy with new eyes. And when I did, I was absolutely astounded by the sheer number of times that they reference the notion of the infinite or some variant of that in this book. So What is Philosophy is really their book on infinities. Anyhow, in What is Philosophy, and also we have to take into account 1,000 Plateaus, we can find the outside further than any exteriority. That corresponds to the inaccessible infinite. It's an inaccessible outside because it's further than any exteriority. 2, resistance to stratification and segmentation. So resistance is prior to power. That corresponds to the infinites by resistance to division and partition. These Badiou's concepts are mathematical and need to be taken in more complete development in terms of their mathematical explications. 3, immanent affirmative powers. These are the distributions of becomings, affects, singularities, and intensities. That corresponds to the infinites by immanent power in Badiou's work. And 4, approaching the absolute horizon of the non-totalizable plane of immanence, consistency by way of absolute deterritorialization. Here again, there's that word, absolute deterritorialization, and absolute horizon. So if it's a horizon, you never really get there, except by some sort of conceptual leap. But you approach it. This is the idea that corresponds to the infinities by increasing proximity to the absolute. The infinite sets. If you get to the absolute, it's a class and not a set. And that's a leap that many mathematicians are not willing to make. Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy is a work which is to a large extent occupied with the ontology of infinity. The words infinite, infinity, and their synonyms, the absolute, the outside, the plane of consistency, the absolute horizon, are to be found on nearly every page, often in multiple occurrences. On the one hand, one could argue from a Badiousian perspective that Deleuze's concepts of infinity are too qualitative too vague and imprecise, and that they remain too intuitive and insufficiently theorized, too close to the poetic end of the spectrum. On the other hand, one could invert the arrow of comparison and argue from a Deleuzian point of view that Badiou's concepts, which are based on the mathematical hierarchy of infinite cardinals, are insufficiently philosophical. While still poetic, they are much closer to the mathematical end of the spectrum, and so represent a slowing down of the plane of consistency. So this critical term, as we said, of slowing down is itself intuitive, qualitative, and poetic. So there's this, in fact, Badiou is saying Deleuze stuff is too intuitive, too poetic, and Deleuze is saying Badiou stuff is too technical, too formalized, too formal, and too mathematical. Deleuze as well tries to give some sort of more substantive content to his side of the accusation by talking about the slowing down from absolute speed, but he doesn't seem to provide any real way of testing that claim or of supporting it. 5. Subjective path, infinite intensities and the unconscious. In his 5th section, it's the last one, but it's a little longer, I will consider the question of what underlies the common ground between Deleuze and Badiou, and of the subjectivation of infinities. Ian Hunter's work on Badiou is very interesting and useful. Okay, Ian Hunter wrote a couple of very interesting articles analysing Badiou's work as requiring a conversion experience, as being particularly adapted to requiring a conversion experience from a special type of intellectual, especially those who went to École Normale Supérieure, or those who have an interest in philosophy and have a very strong interest in mathematics as well. Have a leftist political orientation. So it seems Badiou's system seems perfectly constructed to require the sort of conversion experience that we see maybe in religions, but also in fact in paradigm changes within the hard sciences. So Ian Hunter's work is very interesting and useful, but I see no real problem or uniqueness in the need for subjective conversion that Hunter finds present in Badiou's discourse, as it is a common requirement for any general philosophical research program. Thomas Kuhn has argued that such processes of subjectivation, that's it, a conversion experience, is a type of subjectivation of a paradigm that is proposed to us. Kuhn has shown that such processes of subjectivation are at work even in science, as we know they are in politics and in the arts. So the problem is not conversion. The problem is conversion and stasis or dogmatism. You need conversion. Conversion is just another word for the incommensurable leap. Laruelle, at the beginning of the book, he requires a conversion experience. When empirically you go through that conversion experience is up for grabs. But in order even to understand the propositions of the book, you need this conversion experience, this conversion to the absolute. That's the beginning point, transcendentally, even if empirically it might take us some time to get there. If there were, so that's no problem, the idea of requiring a conversion experience. In fact, it's not a flaw, it's a feature. Conversion experience means incommensurable rupture, and we need incommensurable ruptures to get out of the established predicates and into a new vision of things. If there were a performative contradiction in Badiou's theoretical practice, it would not be between the conflicting requirements, supposedly conflicting requirements of conversion and of philosophical thought, but that between the putative creation of a philosophical elite of Platonic initiates or guardians and his own insistence that anyone can become subject by entering into at least one truth process. So if it were to be shown that the conversion process could be effectuated only by an elite, in particular a mathematized elite, that would be a contradiction in Badiou's thought with his idea of, maybe he doesn't use that word so much, a democracy of thought, what he would call a requirement of equality. So a lot hangs on the idea that we've discussed already of whether the path to the absolute is in essence and uniquely mathematical, or can it be done via the other procedures, or as that is to say art and poem, politics and love, or even as Deleuze or Guattari would say, directly philosophically by way of conceptual creation. That's what Laruelle claims too, despite his talk of science and his refusal of philosophy. What Laruelle is proposing is conceptual creation outside the enclosures of philosophy, what he later calls standard philosophy. So if one can accede to the absolute by these other procedures or by pure intuitive, that may be too deprecatory word, but by pure conceptual leap, then Badiou's appeal to incommensurable conversion is totally compatible with his commitment to his engagement with equality. And the book Immanence of Truths is quite amazing as a book because it has segments of his theatrical works inside. He has poems and intuitive, becoming more and more conceptual analyses of poems, political examples, experience of political militancy. It is a multiple book, and despite the quantitative, in terms of number of pages, preponderance of the mathematical argument, I would say that mathematics is not hegemonic there. It's necessary for Badiou to make the breakthrough that he wants. And once we get to the breakthrough, it can be made available in other ways as well, and may already have been reached, this breakthrough, by other ways. The correspondence with Christian theology is another problem. Badiou systematically downplays the force and influence of religion in his concrete analyses, and this attitude is reflected in his refusal to grant religion the status of a fifth condition. So this comes up because I said maybe, well, because he entertains the idea that it could be a fifth condition, could have been once a fifth condition, or in other societies may function as a fifth condition. I make the suggestion that maybe religion could be included in the condition of love. It comes up because Bruno Latour, in his inquiry into modes of existence, sets up 15 modes of existence that are modes of veridiction, so modes of truth, and religion is one of the conditions. This is something that Laruelle comes back to in Tetralogos, in his much later book from 2019. He gives Badiou good marks for having 4 conditions, because many people just have, many thinkers just have one: poetry, or more often today, science. And Laruelle himself fell into that scientistic trap. He admits it. So Laruelle congratulates Badiou for having 4 conditions, but says, why stop at 4? Why can't we have more conditions? And that seems to be an empirical point in Badiou's theory, in 2 senses. Empirical in that it's just a brute fact. That's just the way it is in our world or in our society, and it's empirical in another sense. One could try and develop analyses compatible with Badiou's system, but not necessarily agreeing with it on all points, but compossible or compatible, or whatever looser term than convergence that one can come up with, sort of divergently compatible, that have more truth procedures. It's that will be one way of testing this point of Badiou's system. The result is that there is a pervasive atmosphere of religiosity in Badiou's works. So that's the result. He's banished religion, and so that's what Ian Hunter has noticed. The religion has come back as a sort of all-pervasive Stimmung or atmosphere of Badiou's style. Not really constantly present, but there is this sort of quasi-religious impression in many passages of Badiou's work, which I think are all to his credit. Manifesto for Philosophy, the first one, when it came out, I was just in ecstasy at the beautiful style and concision of that work. I don't think the English translation captures that enough, but there is such a beautiful and sort of pushing to conversion conversional power of Badiou's style that is quite amazing when you read many of Badiou's supposedly on the mathematical end of the spectrum, but he is on the poetic, quasi-religious end of the spectrum a lot of the time. Badiou himself theorizes this dimension as the need to subjectivate a philosophy. So maybe in secularizing this idea of the religious condition, it will be dealt with within Badiou's system, not as a separate condition, but as this requirement of subjectivation, subjective inclusion in the body of a truth. The question of empirical testability is another crucial problem, and despite his talking in terms of hypotheses, for example, the communist hypothesis, Badiou often uses the empirical world as a source of examples and illustrations, not of tests. And Laruelle got away in a biography of Ordinary Man from examples and illustrations, And his answer seems to be experience is the test, the subject is the test. So subjectivation in Badiou's terms is test enough for Laruelle in that book. However, Badiou's placing his philosophy under the condition of the truth procedures is a way of guaranteeing its indirect testability. So directly as a philosophical system, it may be difficult to test, but indirectly, in terms of the use it makes of the different truth procedures, which are themselves testable, that can trickle back and constitute forms of indirect testability for Badiou's assertions. This redefines the problem of the role of examples in Badiou's text. Direct empirical tests are not the only possible form of validation. Badiou can consider that his configuration of a space of compossibility for the four truth procedures that are themselves testable is test enough. Badiou's method of verifying a hypothesis proposed with reference to one truth procedure by searching for confirming examples in each of the other truth procedures. That's his method. So that's something that we see constantly in Badiou. He can't do it fully systematically, otherwise Immanence of Truths would have been 3 times longer. But in all of his works, Badiou will come up with ideas and an example from a particular truth condition or region, like politics, love, science, or art and poetry, and then he will go through the other domains or conditions to find other totally different examples from these other domains that go with the idea that he's proposing. So that's a rare effort. When Wittgenstein remarked that when a philosopher puts forward a thesis, he or she is often hypnotized by one particular case that is considered paradigmatic, one particular type of example, and doesn't make the effort to vary the context and parameters and come up with quite different cases and see if the thesis is validated once you widen your typology of cases. Badiou is constantly making an effort to revalidate, or to in fact validate, by varying the type of examples that he uses. The problem is not that of Badiou's proceeding hypothetico-deductively. How could that be a problem? But of whether Badiou makes use of this method to stimulate critical discussion or to close it off. Badiou's books on theoretical rivals, such as Deleuze and Heidegger, have shown that he is capable of opening a discussion where previously it seemed impossible. This is an amazing thing with Badiou's book on Deleuze, where often with philosophers like Deleuze, it seems to present itself as a block. If you question one key idea, you have to reject it all. And Badiou, in the Deleuze book, whether one agrees with his analysis or not, gives quite an exemplary example of elaborating his own system of concepts in a large enough, ample enough way that he can engage in a veritable dialogue with Deleuze in that more ample space. And the book that I refer to on Heidegger is his seminar from, I think, Badiou's seminar from 1985-86, which is one of the most amazing, which was devoted to Heidegger, and is one of the most amazing books on Heidegger I've ever seen, because Heidegger is even more than Deleuze, one of these philosophers that, unless you want to quibble on aletheia in Aristotle and the Greeks, or etymological or philological quibbles on this or that point of interpretation of Kant, if you're looking at the core of the system of ideas of Heidegger, it once again seems to come as a fused block. And Badiou is able, by the fact of having developed his own ample enough system, is able to dialogue with Heidegger on equal terms. I've already in another chapter noted that Badiou discusses and rejects the thesis in Heidegger that thinking is questioning. This is something that Laruelle rejects as well, and puts thinking on the side of being conditioned, as does Laruelle. So Badiou, this is another test of Badiou's system and method. If we take as an important criterion that of dialogue, Badiou opens dialogues where none seem possible, not just sort of disputes and criticisms and rejections, but real dialogues, and that is part of the testability of his system in terms of these sorts of criteria, and it's on the positive side. It's a test that turns out positively for Badiou, and maybe not so much for some other people. Deleuze explicitly states that science renounces the infinite, which is left to philosophy. This renunciation, which can be extended to art too, in the terms of what is philosophy, leads, by way of the absolutization of philosophy, to a relativization or finitization of science and art. Thus, in Deleuze's system, art and science cannot provide philosophy with indirect testability. So that's, surprisingly enough, that's in contrast with Badiou's system. Badiou places philosophy and thinking under the condition of the four truth procedures. So his philosophical system can be validated indirectly. Deleuze and Guattari put the infinite within philosophy and say that science, and by implication art, renounce infinity. This is very closely related to the other criterion that they apply of absolute speed and slowing down. And because of this duality, they're absolutizing philosophy. Of course, the absolute and the infinity belong to philosophy, and they're relativizing science and art, and there's a disconnect, which means that at least for this aspect of their system, art and science cannot, because of their own testability, indirectly provide testability for philosophy. Laruelle, one could say, avoids this trap because his absolutization of philosophy gets rid of philosophy and absolutizes, in fact, the transcendental field, the concepts outside the philosophical relative enclosure, and in the same gesture, in A Biography of Ordinary Man, absolutizes science. So there is a claim, a promissory note, if you will, that despite this absolutization, because it's under the condition of science, that there is or will be a form of testability via experience. Badiou's final evaluation of Deleuze's solution is that it is torn between the absolutism of philosophy and of its great inorganic life, close to chaos on the one hand, and on the other, the relativism of bodies and languages. Deleuze's plane of immanence, according to Badiou, is too fragile, as Deleuze's idea of the infinite is too vague through lack of formalization. Finally, Deleuze's subjectivation is too empirical. For Badiou, one must not begin by subjectivating. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere. If we subjectivate, we stay in the relativist region, in hell. Subjectivation, for Badiou, comes after. So, direct subjectivation is reductionism, leads to reductionism and to empiricism, naive empiricism. So what you need is a form of sophisticated subjectivation. This is, I'm just restating how Deleuze's system looks from Badiou's point of view. Badiou's solution is to begin with the formal elaboration of the dialectic between finite and infinite, and only then to subjectivate. Laruelle's solution in those terms is to leap to the transcendental subject first, and then to re-subjectivate what can be re-subjectivated by being inserted, or what he calls reinserted into the one, by means of this subjectivation process. The conditions for this subjective appropriation exist for Badiou. They are the object and the stake, or for everyone, they are the object and the stake of all living philosophy. So we've talked about the three different ways, Badiou's, Deleuze's and Laruelle's approaches to subjective appropriation. According to Badiou, infinite subjective intensities reside in reserve in the unconscious, both as an immanent infinite resource of energy and ideas, and also as an inchoate perception of new possibilities, of which one is as yet unaware that one is capable. So there is still, that sounds very much like a Deleuzean point, this infinite plane, this infinite reserve of energy and ideas, and of inchoate, that is chaotic but emerging into more determinateness, inchoate perception of new possibilities, of which one is as yet unaware that one is capable. One can always, within the wanderings of a life lived without an idea, fall by chance on an infinite intensity incommensurable with our conscious expectations. However, in this case, it is improbable that we recognize the new intensity if we don't already have within us the idea of such an infinity. So this is a very strong claim, and I think it's very close to Laruelle's claim that we must begin with the absolute. We need this idea with a capital I. Otherwise, we'll be just in boring, repetitious, infernal empiricality. So I would say the idea is we can in our life encounter an infinity in love, in trying to change things in society, in trying to create works of art, in trying to create or innovate in the realm of science. But if we don't have this idea of the absolute and of the points of absolutity within our experience, we may cross these points of absoluteness without recognizing them as absolute. We might sort of like them or get pleasure out of them, or we might recoil from them, but we won't have the idea that gives us the perception of absoluteness, and what Badiou calls infinity as well. But Laruelle and Badiou, at least on the idea of absoluteness in ordinary life, agree. This is the paradox of Plato's Menon. We must already have the idea of the infinities, or of the absolute, inside us as immanent intensities, in order to perceive the infinities we encounter in the world, or to perceive the absolute, or the traces or the points of the absolute in the world. At the end of my own path through the book, I can ask myself the question of conversion in its Badiousian form. So we talk about conversion, but that's maybe an all too human, all too empirical concept. So we need to give it a conceptual form, and Badiou's version of conversion would be the question: what has this book made me capable of that I did not know yet, that I did not yet know I was capable of? Yes, the book has made me capable of revisioning pluralism from the perspective of the absolute and of the infinite, of capable of following a quite technical exposition of the mathematics of the higher infinite cardinals and of ascending up to V. The book has inspired me with a poetic vision. It has taught me to speak the language of the absolute and the language of the infinites, and it has allowed me to come to a new understanding of philosophies that I thought I knew. That's already quite a lot. But the most important for me is that the book moves and transforms something deep in the reader's subjectivity. And that's something that happens with Laruelle's books and with Deleuze's books. In my case, and so we're talking about the immanence of truths, it was able to speak to my philosophical unconscious and make me more clearly conscious of infinite intensities and absolute intensities in me, of which I had only an intuitive perception and conception before reading the book. So I've come out of my path of reading The Immanence of Truths totally re-indexed.